A cardboard box sat on the ground in a wooded lot in northeast Philadelphia. It was a J.C. Penney bassinet box, a commercial shipping container, the kind used to package a portable infant's bed, printed with the retailer's name in the ordinary lettering of a mid-century catalog item. The box measured approximately 26 inches in length. It rested on the cold ground of an undeveloped lot near the intersection of Susquehanna Road and Very Road in the Fox Chase neighborhood of the city, and around it the sparse winter brush stood still in the February air. That is where this record begins, not with a person, not yet, and not with an event in motion, but with an object on the ground in a particular place, on a particular morning, in a year that was not so long ago that the people who were children then are not still living. The box had been placed there. It had not arrived by accident or weather or the ordinary drift of discarded things. Someone had carried it to that lot, or transported it in a vehicle and set it down, and whatever the circumstances of that act were, the act itself was complete before the morning of February 25th, 1957, when the world outside that lot began, slowly to take notice. The lot sat along Susquehanna Road as it existed in those years, a road that ran through a part of the city still edged with the character of the countryside it had recently been. Northeast Philadelphia in 1957 was not rural, but it was not yet fully absorbed into the dense residential fabric that would come later. There were stretches of undeveloped land between modest homes, patches of second-growth woodland, vacant lots that had not yet been given over to construction. The lot near the intersection of Susquehanna and Veray was one of these, a semi-wooded piece of ground, its brush and sparse trees sufficient to screen objects from the easy view of a driver passing along the road. Not a forest, not wilderness, simply the kind of overlooked corner that accumulates on the edges of expanding cities, where the attention of pedestrians and drivers tends to pass without stopping. In February, the trees held no leaves. The brush was thin and brown. A light snowfall had come and gone in the days preceding the 25th, and what remained of it had settled in patches on the ground and along the lower branches of the brush, weighing some of it down, whitening the space between the stems and the frozen earth. The air was cold in the way that February air in Philadelphia is cold, not extreme, not blizzard cold, but the persistent damp chill of a northeastern winter that has not yet begun to consider releasing its grip. The lot was quiet. Susquehanna Road carried some traffic, but not heavily, and the lot itself was not part of any regular pedestrian route. There was no reason on an ordinary morning for most people to walk into it. The J.C. Penney bassinet box sat within that lot as a fixed and particular thing. Its printed lettering was visible on the cardboard sides, the commercial language of a retail product, the kind of text that appeared on boxes in storerooms and warehouses, and the back rooms of modest homes where new furniture waited to be assembled. The box was approximately 26 inches long, proportioned for the portable infant's bassinet it had originally been designed to contain. It was not a large box. It was not small either. 26 inches is a specific measurement, the length of something that had to be considered before being chosen, a container that was not simply picked up at random. It had been selected, or at minimum used, as the means by which something was transported to this lot and left here. Around the box, the ground held the ordinary debris of an undeveloped urban margin, dead leaves, old vegetation, the settled residue of seasons passing without any human maintenance. The cold had kept the immediate area in a particular state of preservation. The light snowfall of the preceding days had slowed certain processes that warmth would have accelerated. This was a fact that would matter later, when investigators began to work through what the scene and its contents could be made to tell them. For the moment, in the stillness of the lot, on the morning of the 25th, the box simply sat on the ground in the cold, surrounded by winter brush, not yet reported, not yet the center of anything that had a name. Near the box, a small object lay on the ground. It was a flannel cap, blue and white plaid, the kind of cap worn by a child, a small domestic object of the sort that would sit on a peg near a door in an ordinary home. It had ended up here, in this lot, near this box, and it rested on the cold ground with the particular quality of something that belonged somewhere else, in a different kind of place, without any of the context that would make it make sense. A short distance away, investigators would also recover a small piece of corduroy fabric. These were the only clothing-related items found in association with the box and its contents at the scene: a cap and a scrap of fabric. 2 textile fragments in an undeveloped lot in February, their presence in this place unexplained by anything visible in the immediate landscape. The flannel cap was blue and white. Those are the colors that appear in the record: blue and white plaid, a flannel construction, a child's size. It was the kind of thing that would have been unremarkable in any other setting, the kind of object that passes through the hands of parents and children without particular notice, bought in an ordinary shop, worn on ordinary cold mornings, set down and picked up without ceremony. Here, lying on the ground of a wooded lot beside a cardboard shipping box near the intersection of Susquehanna and Vurry roads, it was something entirely different. Here it was evidence of a kind that investigators would carry forward carefully, a documented detail logged in the record of a case that was just beginning to exist as a case. Susquehanna Road, in February 1957, ran through a part of the city that had not yet completed its transformation from edge territory to settled suburb. The road was there, traffic moved along it, houses sat at varying intervals along its length, some of them with the modest, recently built quality of post-war residential construction, others older, sitting on lots that still had something of the rural character of the region before the city reached it. The intersection at Vere Road was not a notable intersection, not a commercial corner, not a landmark, not a place that drew particular attention. It was simply a crossing on a road that ran through the northeastern portion of a large American city in the middle of the 20th century. The lot near that intersection did not advertise itself. From the road, a driver in a passing vehicle would have had to be looking carefully and at the right angle to see through the brush to the ground where the box sat. The trees were bare, which meant some visibility existed that would not have been there in summer, but the brush was sufficient to interrupt a casual line of sight. A pedestrian walking deliberately into the lot would have seen the box without difficulty. Someone driving along Susquehanna Road at normal speed on a February morning with other things on their mind would not necessarily have noticed anything at all. This is a detail that matters in the record of what happened before February 25th, 1957, and specifically in the days immediately preceding that date. The documentation of the case indicates that at least one person is believed to have encountered the scene in the days before it was officially reported, to have seen or been proximate to what was in that lot, and to have left without reporting it to police. The record does not name this person with certainty, and the documentation of their presence and their decision is incomplete. What it establishes with reasonable clarity is that the box did not wait undiscovered from the moment it was placed there to the morning a man named Frank Guthrum brought it to the attention of the Philadelphia police. Frank Guthrum was a former city employee. He had been in the area near the lot, moving through the same geography of roads and undeveloped land that made up this corner of Fox Chase, and on February 25, 1957, he saw what was in the lot and went to report it. The record places him at the point of official discovery, the moment the case began to exist as a case, the moment Philadelphia police were called to a wooded lot near Susquehanna and Veere and began the documentation that would persist for the next several decades and beyond. What was in the lot, in the box, is what the investigation that followed would spend years attempting to understand. For now, on the morning of the 25th, the facts were narrow and concrete. A cardboard JC penny bassinet box of approximately 26 inches on the cold ground of a semi-wooded lot in northeast Philadelphia, a flannel cap and a fragment of corduroy fabric lying nearby, and a light snowfall from the preceding days still present in patches on the brush and the earth around it. The cold had done its particular work on the scene. February temperatures in Philadelphia, sustained over several days, had slowed the processes that warmer weather accelerates. This is not an abstract observation. It is a forensic one that would bear on what investigators were able to determine from the physical evidence available to them when they arrived at the lot on February 25, 1957. The cold had preserved certain details that warmth would have altered or erased. In that narrow and specific sense, the season had held the scene in a form that could be examined. The lot itself occupied a position in the geography of northeast Philadelphia that was neither central nor remote. It was close enough to residential streets that someone living in the neighborhood could have walked to it without difficulty. It was screened enough from the road that a person approaching it with an object could have set that object down without being easily observed from passing traffic, particularly in the early morning or evening hours, or on a day of low light and empty roads. It was the kind of location that does not draw attention in either direction, not a place anyone would specifically seek out, and not a place that would strike a passing observer as unusual simply by being what it was, a vacant, brushy lot at an unremarkable intersection in the outer reaches of a northeastern American city. The J.C. Penney bassinet box was not a container designed for the purpose it had been made to serve here. It was a commercial packaging item, cardboard, printed with the retailer's name and product information, built to hold a portable infant's bed during shipping, and to be discarded once the contents were unpacked. Boxes of this kind were not unusual in the homes and trash piles of 1950s American neighborhoods. They appeared in domestic settings after purchases were made, sat in basements and garages, were broken down for disposal, or repurposed for storage in the casual and thrifty manner of the period. A J.C. Penny bassinet box in February 1957 was not in itself a remarkable object. It became remarkable only in this location, in this context, on this particular morning. The box had been placed, not dropped. The distinction matters in the record. Though it is a subtle one, the documentation of the scene, as investigators found it, reflects an act of placement, an object set down with some deliberation in a particular spot, in a particular lot. Whatever had preceded that act, whatever the circumstances of the transportation to this location, the box was sitting on the ground in an ordinary posture, its printed J.C. tie, penny lettering facing out, its approximately 26-inch length resting against the cold earth, when Frank Guthrum saw it on the morning of February 25, 1957. Guthrum went to police. That is the single simple fact at the end of the chain of events that brought the case into existence as an official record. He had been in the area near the lot, he had made the discovery, and he reported it. The Philadelphia police responded. An investigation opened. The record that would accumulate over the next 65 years, forensic reports, Witness interviews, leads pursued and not pursued, poster campaigns and tip lines, and DNA extractions and genealogical analyses. All of it began on that morning, when one man looked into a wooded lot along Susquehanna Road and walked away to tell the police what he had seen. The case file that opened on February 25th, 1957, would be maintained through changes in personnel, changes in technology, changes in the city itself. The Fox Chase neighborhood of Northeast Philadelphia would be built out and settled and altered over the following decades, until the quality of edge of city vacancy that characterized the lot in 1957 was largely a memory. Susquehanna Road would still run. The intersection at Vurry would still exist. The location itself would persist, as locations persist, indifferent to what had happened at them. But what was in the lot on the morning of the 25th would become the subject of a documented case, an institutional record, a folder that would be reopened again and again in the years that followed, because the questions it contained were not answered in 1957 and would not be answered for a very long time. The blue and white plaid flannel cap lay near the box on the cold ground. Its color is specific in the record, not simply plaid, but blue and white plaid. The particular color combination of a small child's domestic accessory, a garment that would have been worn in cold weather, pulled down over a child's ears on a morning like this one. It was not on anyone's head when it was found. It was lying on the ground of an undeveloped lot in February, beside a cardboard box, and whatever journey had brought it to that place was entirely opaque. The record describes it. The record does not explain it. The record would go on carrying that particular detail, a blue and white plaid flannel cap lying near a J.C. Penney bassinet box on the cold ground of a wooded lot. For decades, as one of the small fixed points around which everything else in the case arranged itself. The corduroy fragment was also there, a small piece of fabric recovered from the vicinity of the box, its precise dimensions and condition noted in the investigation's documentation, its presence in the lot as unexplained as the caps. Corduroy is a specific material with a specific texture and appearance, and the fragment was specific enough to be recovered and retained as evidence. 2 textile items, a cap and a fragment of fabric, in an undeveloped lot near Susquehanna and Vurry Roads in northeast Philadelphia on a February morning in 1957. The investigation that began on February 25th, 1957, would eventually establish, through the work of the medical examiner and forensic specialists, that the lot was a disposal site rather than a scene of death, that the boy in the box had died somewhere else and been transported to Susquehanna Road afterward. The details of that determination belong to the forensic record and to the examination that followed the discovery. At the moment of discovery, in the cold of the lot on the morning of the 25th, those distinctions were not yet made. The box was there, the cap was there, the fragment of corduroy was there. The investigation was about to begin. It begins, as cases begin, with a specific person choosing to report what they have found. Frank Guthrum was in the area. He saw what was in the lot. He went to police. What he set in motion on that February morning, the official record of a discovery, the opening of an investigation, the first entry in a case file that would be continuously maintained for the decades that followed, began with that single act. A former city employee in a wooded lot near Susquehanna and Vurry Roads choosing to walk away and tell someone what he had seen. At least one other person, the record suggests, had already seen it and not made that choice. The documentation of that possibility is incomplete, and the identity of that person is not confirmed in the material that investigators placed in the case file. What it adds to the picture is only this: the box had been there, in the cold and the quiet of the Fox Chase lot, for some number of days before February 25th, 1957. The light snowfall had come and settled, and the cold had held the scene while the days passed. And at some point before Guthrum went to police, another person had been in proximity to what was there and had left without reporting it. The record holds this detail without explanation, as it holds many details in this case, noted, documented, placed in the file, and carried forward into a future in which the questions around it were not yet answered. It is one of the small, specific, unexplained facts that make up the record of the discovery of the boy in the box, a case that would begin on a February morning in 1957 in a wooded lot in northeast Philadelphia and remain open, actively, officially, institutionally open for the next 65 years and beyond. The J.C. Penney bassinet box, 26 inches in length, printed commercial lettering on cardboard, cold ground, sparse winter brush, a flannel cap, blue and white plaid, lying nearby, a fragment of corduroy fabric recovered from the vicinity, light snowfall in patches on the surrounding vegetation, a semi-wooded lot at the intersection of Susquehanna Road and Very Road in the Fox Chase neighborhood of northeast Philadelphia, on a February morning in 1957. These are the opening coordinates of the record. They are specific and they are confirmed. They do not, by themselves, explain anything. They are simply what was there. The wooded lot sat at a particular remove from the ordinary movement of the neighborhood around it. Not invisible, the road was nearby, and occasional pedestrian traffic in the area was not impossible, but sufficiently screened that the lot did not present itself as a place of interest to anyone passing at normal speed on an ordinary February day. The intersection at Susquehanna and Very was not a busy one. The traffic that moved through it did so without particular reason to slow, and the lot on its margin was simply one of the undeveloped corners that remained in the Fox Chase neighborhood as its surrounding areas continued to be built out. In that geography, in that season, in that year, the box had been placed. The record is clear on the date it was found. It is less clear, and will remain less clear, on the date it was placed there. An earlier point in February 1957, a night or a morning that no confirmed witness has been able to fix precisely. The cold had done something to preserve the scene, and investigators working the case in the days following the 25th would note the temperature's effect on what they were able to examine, but the specific date of placement is one of the questions that the record, even in its most complete form, does not answer. What the record does hold is the shape of the discovery: a wooded lot, a cardboard box, a blue and white plaid flannel cap on the cold ground beside it, a fragment of corduroy fabric in the vicinity, and one man who saw these things and went to tell the police. Frank Guthrum brought the case into existence as an official record on February 25th, 1957. The investigation that followed was large and long, and in many of its central questions unresolved. What it began with was this: a corner of northeast Philadelphia in February, a J.C. Penney bassinet box sitting on the earth in a semi-wooded lot, and one man's decision to report what he had found, while others, it appeared, had chosen not to. That moment, the moment Guthrum walked away from the lot to find a phone, to find a police station, to set in motion the official response that would bring detectives and forensic specialists to Susquehanna Road, is the beginning of everything that follows in the record of this case. It is a quiet moment. It is a specific one, and it carries, in the simple fact of its having happened after other people apparently did not make the same choice, a particular weight that the record does not elaborate on, but also does not remove. The case began on February 25th, 1957, when Frank Guthrum told the Philadelphia police what he had found. Before that, there was only the lot, and the box, and the cold, and the blue and white plaid cap lying on the ground beside it in the stillness of a winter morning on the edge of a city. The brush around the lot was thin in February, stripped of the leaf cover that would have made the space more private in another season. What remained was a lattice of bare stems and low branches, brown against the pale gray sky, sufficient to interrupt a casual line of sight from the road without entirely concealing what lay within. The ground between the brush was uneven, marked by frost heaves and the compressed debris of accumulated seasons. Old leaves, broken vegetation, the kind of understory that develops without management in a vacant lot over a period of years. In this ground, the box sat. In this air, the cap lay. In this particular place, on this particular morning, the case came to light. It is worth sitting with the plainness of that. Not with alarm, not with dread, but with the particular quality of attention that specific details in specific places deserve. The cold that had come in from the northwest over the preceding days, the light snowfall that had settled and stayed, the printed lettering on the cardboard side of a J. See, penny bassinet box, the blue and white of a flannel cap's plaid against the neutral winter ground. These details belong to the case. They are the case's opening coordinates, the fixed points around which everything else, the forensic examination, the investigation, the poster campaign, the decades of open questions, the DNA analysis, the name finally found after 65 years, would eventually arrange itself. But all of that was later. On the morning of February 25th, 1957, the record shows only the beginning. A wooded lot in northeast Philadelphia, a cardboard box on cold ground, and Frank Guthrum walking away from what he had found to bring it to the attention of the police, while somewhere behind him, in the stillness of the lot, the sparse winter brush stood quiet around the things he had left there. The medical examiner's record placed the boy at approximately 40 to 41 inches tall and a weight of around 30 pounds. Those measurements were set down in February of 1957, entered into a forensic file as the first confirmed facts about a child whose name was not yet known and would not be known for 65 years. The numbers themselves, read plainly, indicated that his height and his weight did not correspond to each other in the way a well-nourished child's height and weight would correspond. At 40 to 41 inches, a child of the age the examiner estimated would be expected to weigh considerably more. The weight recorded in that file was the weight of a significantly undernourished body, and that detail, like every other detail in the examination, was documented with the careful specificity of a record meant to be consulted over and over again across a long period of time. The age range the examiner established was between 4 and 6 years old. That range, arrived at through assessment of the boy's skeletal development and physical characteristics, would be revisited by forensic reviewers across the following decades, and the consensus that accumulated through those subsequent reviews most often placed him toward the younger end of that range, at approximately 4 to 5 years of age. 4 to 5 years old, 40 to 41 inches tall, approximately 30 pounds. Those three numbers taken together constituted the first descriptive record that investigators had of a child who had arrived at Susquehanna Road without a name, without documentation, and without anyone who came forward to say they recognized him. The examination produced a great deal more than those opening measurements. that produced a detailed physical record of what the boy's body showed and what it contained, a record that would be copied, referenced, reproduced in artist reconstructions, and carried forward through 6.5 decades of investigative work. That record began with the measurements, but it did not stop there. It moved methodically through a set of physical findings, each one noted with the specific precision that a forensic examination requires, and the document that resulted from that process became, in practical terms, the most complete description investigators would have of who the boy was in physical terms for many years. His hair had been recently cut. That finding appeared in the examination record and was noted with some specificity. The cut was uneven in its execution, consistent with trimming done at home rather than by a professional barber. The scissors, or whatever implement had been used, had not produced a clean or uniform result, and the hair was shorter on some sides than others, the edges not carefully finished, the overall effect of a cut done quickly or by someone without training in the task. That kind of detail, a small domestic observation recorded in a forensic file, was the kind of detail investigators returned to repeatedly in the years that followed, because it indicated something about the circumstances of the boy's life in the period shortly before his death. Someone had attended to his hair, had made an effort to trim it, even if the result was imprecise. The examination also recorded that his fingernails had been trimmed and cleaned. That finding, noted alongside the recent haircut, documented a further act of physical attention. Someone had trimmed the boy's nails in the period before he died, had seen to that particular aspect of his care. Both of those details, the haircut and the cleaned fingernails, were recorded in the same examination document as findings that indicated a certain kind of attention had been paid to the boy's grooming. They were noted together in the forensic record and held together by investigators as a pair of observations that existed in the same file as the evidence of his prolonged malnourishment and his healed and unhealed injuries. The examination did not interpret the juxtaposition, it recorded it. The dunk, the haircut, and the nails on one side of the ledger, the weight and the bruising on the other, and the file held both without resolving them. The bruising documented in the examination was noted as showing evidence of injuries at multiple stages of healing. That finding indicated that the damage to the boy's body had not occurred at a single point in time. There were bruises that were older and bruises that were more recent, a distribution of injury across the body that suggested a pattern of physical trauma sustained over an extended period. The examination noted this without speculating about its origin. The finding was that the bruising reflected injuries at different stages, some older, some newer, and that finding was entered into the forensic record as a documented observation, not an interpretation. Alongside the bruising, the examination found evidence of healed rib fractures. Those fractures, recorded in the medical examiner's findings, had knit together in the way bones do over time. They had been broken, and the body had worked to repair them in the weeks or months that followed, and by the time the examination was conducted, they had healed to the degree that they were detectable as old injuries rather than recent ones. They had received no medical treatment. That was the further finding. The fractures had healed without intervention, without a cast or a splint, without any of the clinical support that would ordinarily accompany a broken rib in a child. They were the record of injuries that had healed on their own, over time, in a body that had continued to live and move while the bones repaired themselves. The examination noted them. They were documented, and the documentation was preserved. The official cause of death was determined to be homicide. The Philadelphia Medical Examiner recorded blunt force trauma to the head as the primary finding in reaching that determination. That finding was entered into the case file and remained the foundational forensic conclusion of the official record. Over the following decades, as the case was reviewed periodically by forensic professionals and the file was returned to by successive investigators, some reviewers noted the possibility that additional mechanisms might have been involved alongside the blunt force finding. Those observations were part of the forensic discussion surrounding the case, positions taken by individuals who had examined the available evidence and found reason to consider that the recorded cause of death might represent an incomplete accounting. The official record, however, carried the medical examiner's original conclusion as its primary documentation: homicide. Blunt force trauma to the head, entered in February of 1957 and not formally amended in the years that followed. Within the examination record, there was also a specific anatomical detail of a different kind, one that carried a different kind of significance for investigators. The boy had a surgical scar. It was described as L-shaped, located on his chin or lower jaw area. A scar of that kind, surgical in its character, situated in that location, indicated that at some point in the boy's life prior to his death, a medical procedure had been performed. Someone had made an incision. A physician had been involved. The wound had healed under clinical conditions, leaving the distinct scarring pattern that the medical examiner documented and that was carried forward into every subsequent description of the boy's physical characteristics. That small mark on his jaw was, in a specific and practical sense, a record of a moment when he had been seen by medicine, when the systems of clinical care had encountered him, had acted on him, had left a trace. The examination also documented additional physical characteristics that were noted for their potential identifying value. The boy had a low frontal hairline, a hairline positioned lower on the forehead than average, a characteristic of his natural growth pattern that the examination recorded as a distinguishing feature. He also had a slight forehead asymmetry, a mild difference in proportion between one side of his forehead and the other, subtle enough that it would not have been immediately apparent to a casual observer, but present enough to be documented by the medical examiner and to be reproducible in a careful physical description. Those features, the low hairline, the forehead asymmetry, were the kind of characteristics that forensic artists could work with, the details that, when translated from written description into visual representation, could produce a recognizable rendering of what the boy's face had looked like in life. The forensic documentation produced for the case was, in part, an attempt to answer a question that the medical examination alone could not fully answer. What had this boy looked like when he was alive, in motion, in expression, in the ordinary circumstances of a child's daily existence? The examination could document the static facts of his physical form as it appeared at the time of examination. The artist reconstructions attempted to translate those static facts into something closer to a living face. The low hairline was rendered carefully, situated on the brow at the position the forensic record described. The forehead asymmetry was incorporated, given its proper degree of subtlety. The proportions recorded in the examination were used to construct a face that might, in theory, be recognized by someone who had seen it before. Those reconstructions were produced from the forensic record, grounded entirely in what the documentation showed, and they carried the same physical characteristics that the examination had found: the low hairline, the slight asymmetry, the features of a child between 4 and 5 years old, who weighed approximately 30 pounds and measured 40 to 41 inches in height. The detail of the recently cut hair, uneven and home-trimmed, sat within that reconstruction context as a complicating element. The hair shown in some representations was short, reflecting the recent trimming noted in the examination. It was the hair of a child whose grooming had been attended to in the period before his death, cut by someone with access to him in a domestic setting without professional tools or professional results. The forensic artists worked with what the record provided. The record provided the low hairline, the slight asymmetry, the approximate age, the recently cut hair. The reconstructions were built from those materials. The weight of 30 pounds, returned to again and again in the forensic documentation, occupied a particular place in the physical record. It was a number that carried information beyond its simple arithmetic. A child of 4 to 5 years of age, standing 40 to 41 inches tall, would in ordinary circumstances of adequate nutrition be expected to weigh substantially more. The gap between the recorded weight and the expected weight for a child of that height and estimated age was significant enough to be documented explicitly as evidence of malnourishment. That finding was part of the official record from the beginning. Set down alongside the bruising at various stages of healing and the healed rib fractures that had received no treatment, and the combination of those findings produced a picture of a child whose physical condition, across a period preceding his death, had not been what it should have been. The examination record did not editorialize on those findings. It documented them in the manner of a forensic report. The weight, the height, the age estimate, the bruising, the fractures, the cause of death, the distinguishing characteristics. Each item entered as a finding, supported by the physical evidence before the examiner, recorded in the language of clinical documentation. The file that resulted from that process was careful and precise, assembled to be useful to investigators, to be consulted across time, to remain a reliable record even as years passed and the people who had conducted the examination moved on. It was built to last in the way forensic documentation is built to last, not for a single investigative moment, but for the long duration of an unresolved case. Some findings in the examination held particular weight for investigators, not because of what they confirmed, but because of the questions they opened. The surgical scar was one of those. A scar of that type and in that location is the result of a procedure performed by a trained clinician in a setting equipped for such work. Boat back. That procedure would have required some form of documentation. There would have been records, clinical notes, surgical records, the documentation that medical practice generates and in some form preserves. A child who had undergone a procedure, leaving an L-shaped scar on his chin or lower jaw, had been at some point a patient. There were records somewhere that corresponded to that encounter. Investigators understood the scar as a potential thread, a physical mark that pointed toward a moment in the boy's history when he had been inside a medical system that kept records. Finding those records, matching them to a child who matched the physical description, was one of the avenues the investigation pursued. The thread was followed. The records were not found, at least not in the years of investigation that followed immediately after the case opened. The healed rib fractures occupied a different investigative position. Their significance was not as a potential thread leading to a medical record, because they had healed without medical attention. There would be no clinical record of their treatment, because they had received none. Their significance was what they indicated about the period of time over which the boy's physical condition had developed. Rib fractures in a child do not heal in days. They heal over weeks, in some cases longer. The fractures noted in the examination had healed, which placed the injuries that caused them in a prior period, before the examination, before the boy arrived at Susquehanna Road, in the part of his history that the investigation was attempting to reconstruct from physical evidence and from the record that his body itself had kept. The examination found those fractures, noted them as healed and untreated, and entered them into the file. The boy's estimated age was one of the findings that subsequent reviews engaged with most closely. The range of 4 to 6 years, established in the original examination, was the range from which investigators worked in the years immediately following the case. Over the following decades, as the case was reviewed and as forensic science developed additional methodologies for estimating age from skeletal remains, that range was refined. The consensus that developed through those reviews placed the boy most often at 4 to 5 years of age, toward the lower end of the original estimate. That refinement did not change the fundamental picture the examination had produced, but it adjusted one of its edges, narrowing the range through the application of additional expertise to the same underlying physical record. The forensic record was, in a practical sense, the only documentary history the boy had for 65 years. No birth certificate had been matched to him. No family had come forward to identify him. No school record, no medical record, no name on a poster recognized as belonging to a specific missing child. None of those potential sources of identity had produced a confirmed result in the initial decades of the investigation. What remained, consistently present and consistently available, was the examination record produced in February of 1957. That record described a child who was between 4 and 5 years old, who stood 40 to 41 inches tall, who weighed approximately 30 pounds, whose hair had been recently and unevenly cut, whose fingernails had been trimmed and cleaned, whose body showed bruising at multiple stages of healing and healed rib fractures that had received no treatment, and who had a surgical scar, L-shaped, on his chin or lower jaw. That description was the closest thing to a biographical record that the case held for most of its duration. It was the record of what his body had shown to the examiner who documented it, and it was the record that was carried forward, copied, referenced, and reproduced across the decades that followed. Artist reconstructions produced over those decades returned repeatedly to the same set of physical characteristics. The low frontal hairline, placed carefully at the position the forensic record described. The slight forehead asymmetry, rendered with the degree of subtlety that the documentation indicated. The proportions of a child of 4 to 5 years, the approximate weight and height translated into the visual impression of a small, slightly built boy. The hair, short and unevenly trimmed, shown in some reconstructions as it had been found, recently cut. The uneven edges of a home trim, the kind of cutting done with ordinary scissors by someone without particular skill in the task. Those reconstructions moved through their own iterative history, produced at different points in the investigation by artists working from the same underlying documentation, each one an attempt to translate the written forensic record into a face that a living person might recognize. The written forensic record remained the authoritative version. The reconstructions were interpretations of it, careful ones, built by skilled artists working from the specific physical details the examination had documented. But the record itself, the file produced in February of 1957, was the primary document, the source from which everything else derived. The estimated height of 40 to 41 inches, the estimated weight of approximately 30 pounds, the estimated age of 4 to 5 years, the recently trimmed, unevenly cut hair, the cleaned and trimmed fingernails, the bruising at various stages of healing, the healed rib fractures that had knit together without treatment, the blunt force trauma to the head, recorded as the basis for the medical examiner's determination of homicide, the low frontal hairline and the slight forehead asymmetry, both documented and reproducible, and the L-shaped surgical scar on the chin or lower jaw, a small specific mark indicating that a physician had once been involved, that a procedure had been performed, that a clinical record existed somewhere in the network of medical documentation that the boy had moved through in the years before he arrived at Susquehanna Road. The examination was completed. The findings were recorded. The file was assembled with the care that a case of this kind required, built to be consulted over a long period of time, to remain available to investigators working years or decades after the original document was produced. It was the kind of record that forensic work generates when the questions it is designed to answer are not immediately answerable. A complete and precise description of what was known, held carefully against the time when additional knowledge might make it possible to match the documentation to something outside the file, to a name, to a family, to a history. The scar, noted in the file as L-shaped, located on the chin or lower jaw, was described with the same documentary precision as every other finding in the examination. It was a physical characteristic like the others: the low hairline, the forehead asymmetry, the estimated height and age, in the sense that it was observable, documentable, and reproducible in description. It was distinct from the others in what it implied about the boy's prior life. Every other anatomical characteristic in the record was simply what it was: the dimensions of his body, the proportions of his face, the natural features of his physical form as they had developed over the 4 to 5 years of his life. The scar was different. It was the trace of an event, a procedure performed in a clinical setting, a mark left on his body by the intervention of medicine. It meant he had been seen. At some point, a physician had examined the area of his chin or jaw, had determined that a procedure was necessary, had performed it, and had left the L-shaped evidence of that work in the tissue of his lower face. The boy had been a patient. The record of that encounter was, somewhere, in the documentation that medical practice maintains. Investigators held the scar as a thread that might, if followed far enough, lead to a moment in the boy's history that had been recorded: a name in a file, a date, a location, a clinical notation corresponding to a procedure that had left an L-shaped mark on the chin or lower jaw of a small child. The thread was there. The file it led to remained, for the time being, unfound. The examination record held what it held. The forensic documentation of the boy who had been found at Susquehanna Road in February of 1957 was a careful, precise, professionally produced account of what his body showed to the people who examined it: the weight, the height, the age, the hair, the nails, the bruising, the fractures, the cause of death, the hairline, the asymmetry, and the scar on his chin or lower jaw, L-shaped, surgical in character, the quiet evidence that a physician had once taken him in hand, had worked on him, had stitched or cut or otherwise intervened, and had left on the surface of his face a mark that the medical examiner noted in February of 1957, and that investigators carried forward as a potential thread, one of the physical details that might, if matched to a clinical record somewhere in the systems of documentation that surrounded him, begin to draw the outline of a history. The file noted it, the file held it, and the scar remained in the record, as it still does, a small specific mark on the chin or lower jaw of a child who was 4 to 5 years old, who had once been seen by a physician and whose name took 65 more years to find. A plaster cast requires stillness. The material is applied carefully, layer by layer, to a surface that cannot move, and then it is left to set, and when it is lifted away, what remains is a precise and permanent record of the form that was held beneath it. The forensic specialist who produced the death mask of the boy found on Susquehanna Road would have worked in that manner, methodically, attentively, with the understanding that what was being made was not a memorial, but a document, a three-dimensional record of specific features that could be photographed and reproduced and carried wherever the investigation needed it to go. The mask was completed in the days shortly after the body was recovered, in February of 1957, and it became one of the primary. The Philadelphia Police Department took investigative responsibility from the first day. Officers and detectives worked the case from February 25, 1957, with the Federal Bureau of Investigation providing support in an assisting capacity, running the boy's fingerprints through national databases, helping to move identifying information across state lines, contributing the reach of a federal system to what remained, jurisdictionally, a Philadelphia case. The FBI's fingerprint records produced nothing. The boy's prints were not in any database. Whatever life he had lived before Susquehanna Road, it had not brought him into contact with systems that left a fingerprint record, and so that particular line of inquiry closed without a result. The plaster mask, though, was a different kind of instrument. It was not searching against a fixed database. It was an image that could be looked at by anyone, recognized by anyone who had ever seen the boy's face in life. A parent, a neighbor, a teacher, a relative. Anyone who had been near him in the years before his death. Photographs of the mask were made and distributed. They went first to law enforcement agencies in the region, then further to departments across Pennsylvania and into neighboring states, and eventually, as the investigation extended its reach, to agencies across the country. The photographs traveled in envelopes through the postal system, filed into inboxes at police stations from Philadelphia to the West Coast, held in folders by officers who reviewed them alongside the written description of the boy, his age range, his height, his weight, his particular physical details, and then set them aside when nothing in their jurisdiction matched. The distribution of those photographs was careful, institutional work. It was not dramatic. It was the methodical circulation of a documented physical record through the established channels of mid-century American law enforcement. And it took time, and it required coordination, and it produced, in the months following the discovery, a widening circle of awareness about the unidentified boy whose body had been found in a cardboard box on a semi-rural road in northeast Philadelphia. From the photographs and from the physical description established by the medical examination, investigators and community advocates worked to produce something with a wider reach still. The poster that emerged from that effort was headed with a phrase that would follow the case for the rest of the 20th century. It read, in large type, America's Unknown Child. Below the heading were photographs, images derived from the forensic record, the boy's features rendered as clearly as the available materials allowed, and a physical description that laid out what the examination had established, the estimated age, the height, the weight, the hair, the particular identifying detail of the surgical scar. The poster named a contact point for anyone with information and asked, in the direct and simple language of a public appeal, whether anyone knew this child. The printing and circulation of that poster was an undertaking that drew on networks beyond law enforcement. Civic organizations helped distribute it. Religious groups passed it through their membership. Post offices accepted it and displayed it in their public-facing spaces, where it joined the other notices and public information materials that lined the walls of postal lobbies across the United States. The postal system in the late 1950s was one of the most reliable channels through which information moved across the country, a physical network that reached every address, every rural route, every small town post office, where a poster could be displayed and read by the people who came to collect their mail. Through that network, and through the parallel channels of law enforcement and civic organization, The image of the boy and the phrase America's unknown child reached communities across multiple states and eventually across the whole of the country. The response was large. Letters arrived at the Philadelphia Police Department from people in Pennsylvania and New Jersey and New York, from people in states far from Philadelphia, from people who had seen the poster at a post office, or heard about the case from a neighbor, or read a mention of it in a local newspaper. Some of the letters contained specific names, people writing to say that the description matched a child they had known, a nephew or a student, or a child from a family in their neighborhood who had disappeared, a boy whose absence had never been fully explained. Other letters were less specific, but no less earnest, offering what the writers believed might be useful context: a family that had moved suddenly, a child seen in circumstances that had never felt right, a memory that had persisted, and that the writer had decided, upon seeing the poster, to commit to paper and send to the investigators working the case. Detectives logged those tips and followed them. The investigative process of running down leads from a public appeal is methodical and slow. Each tip represents a possible thread that must be pulled carefully. Time requires a record check. An address requires a visit. A family that moved suddenly requires tracing through city directories and census records and the institutional documentation that marks the movement of people through time and place. A significant portion of the tips arrived from outside Philadelphia, which required coordination with law enforcement in other jurisdictions, correspondence between departments, and the patient exchange of information across distances that, in the late 1950s, moved at the pace of the mail or the telephone rather than anything faster. The FBI's involvement helped with some of that coordination, providing a federal channel through which information could move between local departments that might not otherwise have communicated with one another. None of the leads pursued during the initial investigative period, the years from 1957 through the early 1960s, when the poster campaign was most active and the volume of tips was at its highest, produced a confirmed identification. The detectives who worked those tips found, in case after case, that the child they were looking for was not the boy in the box. A family's missing child turned out to be accounted for through records that could be located. A name provided by a concerned neighbor, when traced through available documentation, led to a living person. The specific convergence of the physical details, the age, the height, the weight, the surgical scar, the particular features documented in the forensic record, did not match anything that emerged from the thousands of pieces of correspondence and telephone information that arrived in response to the America's Unknown Child campaign. The case remained open. It did not close for lack of work. The original investigation had brought together the resources of the Philadelphia Police Department, the federal reach of the FBI, the civic networks that had distributed the poster, and the voluntary participation of thousands of ordinary people across the country who had written or called because they thought they might know something. The accumulated product of all that effort, the tips logged, the records checked, the leads pursued and exhausted, was a file that grew through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, adding documentation as the investigation continued, marking each thread that had been pulled and found to lead nowhere conclusive. That file was the institutional memory of the case. It held the record of every name that had been checked and cleared, every family that had been visited and confirmed not to be the boys, every promising lead that had eventually closed without producing the identification that would have allowed the case to move forward into prosecution. The file was also, in a sense, the evidence of how much the case had mattered to the people who had worked it, not as an abstraction, but as a specific, ongoing institutional commitment to a specific unnamed child, documented in every tip followed and every door knocked on across the years of the original investigation. Alongside the investigative record, the boy existed in a physical place. In March of 1957, before the investigation had run its course, before the poster campaign had produced its thousands of responses, before the leads had been traced and exhausted, the boy was buried. A donated plot at Ivy Hill Cemetery in the Germantown section of Philadelphia was made available for him. The people who arranged the burial, local citizens, civic groups who had been following the case, individuals who felt the weight of an unburied and unnamed child, contributed to the cost of a gravestone. The stone that was placed at the head of the grave carried a phrase that had been chosen, it seems, with care. It read, "Heaven's Child." The grave existed at Ivy Hill for decades. The investigation continued around it, and the case accumulated its history of effort and partial result and ongoing open status. And the boy remained where he had been placed in March of 1957, beneath a small stone in a Philadelphia cemetery, still unnamed. The gravestone became, over the years, a kind of landmark, not in any official or designated sense, but in the informal sense that people knew it was there, that it marked the resting place of a child whose name had not been found, that it was the physical location where the case had its most permanent and concrete form. People visited, flowers were left. The grave was tended by individuals who had no direct connection to the case, but who felt in some particular way that it mattered to maintain it. The case also moved outward through the decades in other forms. Writers who covered crime and cold cases documented the boy in the box in books and articles. Journalists returned to it periodically, particularly when the Philadelphia Police Department made announcements about renewed investigative activity, or when a new lead appeared to warrant public attention. The phrase "America's Unknown Child," which had first appeared on the poster distributed in the late 1950s, became the informal name by which the case was known to people who followed such things. A phrase that carried the weight of the original appeal, the original question of who the boy was and where he had come from, forward through the years in which the question remained unanswered. The Vidocq Society entered the record of the case at a somewhat later point in its history. The organization, based in Philadelphia, was founded in 1990 and named for a 19th century French detective whose career had become a kind of foundational story for investigative practice. The Society's membership was drawn from forensic professionals and experienced investigators, people whose working lives had brought them into contact with evidence and methodology and the particular difficulties of cases that had grown cold over years. The boy in the box was among the cases to which the Vidocq Society turned its attention across the 1990s as the organization developed its practice of reviewing difficult and unresolved investigations in collaboration with the law enforcement agencies that held them. The collaboration between the Vidocq Society and the Philadelphia Police Department on the boy in the box case had a particular and consequential outcome in the late 1990s. By that decade, DNA analysis had developed into a forensic tool of substantial power, a technology that had not existed when the boy was buried in 1957, that had developed gradually through the 1980s, and that by the 1990s was being applied to cold cases across the country, with results that were, in a number of instances, decisive. To extract DNA from a burial that had taken place 40 years earlier required a sample. A sample required access to the remains. Access to the remains, given that the boy was buried at Ivy Hill Cemetery, required an exhumation. The exhumation at Ivy Hill Cemetery was carried out in 1998. It was a careful forensic procedure not undertaken lightly, but undertaken because the analytical technology that had become available since 1957 made it possible to extract information from the boy's remains that could not have been extracted before. Bone and tooth samples were taken. These are the materials from which DNA profiles can, under the right conditions, be derived. Hard biological tissues that preserve genetic information over long periods in ways that soft tissue does not. The samples taken during the 1998 exhumation were preserved for analysis, held in the forensic record as materials available for examination using whatever methods existed at the time and whatever methods might become available in the future. Following the exhumation, the boy's remains were not returned to the original plot at Ivy Hill Cemetery. Instead, they were moved to an undisclosed location, a decision made by those responsible for the case, in consultation with the investigators and organizations involved, because the Ivy Hill grave had experienced vandalism over the years. The specific circumstances and nature of that vandalism were not widely documented in the public record, but the decision to move the remains to a location that would not be publicly identified was a protective one, made on behalf of the boy whose grave had been left without the anonymity that protection sometimes requires. The gravestone reading, "Heaven's Child," remained for a time as a marker at the original site, a quiet artifact of the case's long history at that particular cemetery. The DNA samples taken in 1998 were analyzed in the period following the exhumation. A genetic profile was derived from the bone and tooth materials. That profile was submitted to available databases and checked against existing records, and the analysis produced results that were examined carefully and followed through the investigative process. The forensic work of the late 1990s did not produce an identification. The technology that existed in 1998 and the databases against which the profile could be matched were not sufficient to close the gap between the genetic record extracted from the boy's remains and any living relative who might confirm his identity. The identification, when it came, would require a different moment and a different configuration of available tools. What the 1998 exhumation and the DNA sampling produced was a preserved capability, a genetic profile held in the forensic record, samples retained in evidence, a documented biological record of the boy derived from his own remains that could be carried forward into whatever future held the tools that 1998 did not yet have. The case had been reopened in a particular physical and forensic sense, and then carefully secured again with new material that extended its potential reach without immediately resolving its central question. The Vidic Society's involvement in the case did not conclude with the exhumation. The organization continued to hold the boy in the box among the cases it reviewed, returning to it as new investigative approaches became available and as the forensic landscape shifted around the preserved record. That continued engagement was part of what kept the case within the awareness of forensic professionals across the decades between the 1998 exhumation and the next significant development, a long period during which the file remained open, the samples remained preserved, and the question of who the boy was remained, as it had been since February of 1957, the central unanswered question in the record. The poster campaign of the late 1950s had been, in its time, a full deployment of the available tools: print reproduction, physical distribution through postal and civic networks, the organized appeal to the public attention of an entire country. It had produced thousands of responses and had not produced an identification. The DNA sampling of 1998 had been a full deployment of the available tools of its own time: exhumation, bone and tooth extraction, genetic profiling, database comparison. It had produced a preserved capability and had not produced an identification. Each period of investigative activity had done what it could with what existed at the time, and each had extended the record without closing it. This is the particular quality of the Boy in the Box case as it accumulated across the second half of the 20th century, not a case that had been neglected, not a case that had gone cold through indifference, but a case that had been worked repeatedly and carefully with the tools of successive decades, each round of effort documented in the file, each round producing a more complete and more capable record. Even when it did not produce the resolution the investigation was working toward. The thousands of letters logged in response to the America's Unknown Child poster were not wasted work. The plaster death mask and its distribution through law enforcement channels were not wasted work. The exhumation and the preserved DNA samples were not wasted work. They were the accumulation of a sustained institutional commitment, documented across 40 years, to answering a question that had not yet yielded to the tools available to answer it. The America's Unknown Child poster itself had a persistence beyond the years of the original campaign. Reprints and references to it appeared in books and articles across the following decades. The phrase became associated with the case in a durable way, a shorthand that carried the original appeal forward through time, connecting the moment of the poster's production in the late 1950s to every subsequent discussion of the case in every medium in which it appeared. When a new writer took up the case, the poster was referenced. When a journalist revisited the story for a feature, the poster was described. When the case entered the early years of internet coverage and the online forums and message boards that developed in the 1990s and 2000 as spaces for people interested in cold cases and unidentified persons, the poster was reproduced and circulated again, finding new audiences through a distribution channel that would have been unimaginable to the investigators who had originally printed it and sent it through the mail. The online communities that developed around cold cases in the internet era brought a particular kind of sustained attention to the Boy in the Box. Amateur researchers and investigators, genealogists with access to digitized historical records, people with specialized knowledge of particular aspects of the forensic record. All of these contributed to a sustained public engagement with the case that ran parallel to the official investigative record and occasionally intersected with it. Theories were proposed and examined. The physical evidence was analyzed and reanalyzed in forum discussions that could run to hundreds of posts. The specific details of the case, the J.C. Penney bassinet box, the plaid flannel cap, the corduroy fabric, the surgical scar, the uneven haircut were scrutinized repeatedly by people who were not investigators, but who brought genuine care and analytical effort to the question of who the boy had been. That sustained public attention was part of the environment in which the case continued to exist as the 20th century closed and the 21st century opened. The Philadelphia Police Department's homicide unit continued to carry the case as an active investigation. The Vidocq Society continued to hold it among the cases it reviewed. The preserved DNA samples continued to sit in the forensic record, available, and the public engagement with the case, formal and informal, institutional and amateur, continued to produce the ambient pressure of ongoing attention that kept the question of the boy's identity in circulation, available to be picked up by anyone who encountered it and found it, as many people across many decades apparently did, worth following. The gravestone at Ivy Hill, with its carved phrase, "Heaven's Child," had stood as the most tangible marker of the case's long persistence. It had been placed there in 1957 by people who could not give the boy his name, but could give him a grave and a marker, and it had remained after the remains beneath it had been moved to a protected location, and it continued to exist in the record of the case as an image of what the community around the case had been willing to do in the absence of the information that would have allowed them to do something more specific, a name on a stone rather than a designation, an act of civic care in the face of an unanswered question. The stone itself was a document of a kind, evidence that people had known about the boy, had cared about him as a specific unnamed child rather than as a category or a statistic, and had expressed that care in a permanent material form while the investigation continued around them. By the time the 21st century was well underway, the tools available to forensic investigators had shifted substantially from what had existed in 1998. Investigative genetic genealogy, the methodology of deriving a genetic profile from biological remains and matching it against voluntarily submitted profiles in consumer genealogy databases, then building outward from distant matches through multi-generational family trees, had developed into a powerful and increasingly refined approach to cases where conventional DNA database matching had produced nothing. The methodology had produced identifications and resolutions in a number of long unresolved cases before it was turned toward the boy in the box. The preserved genetic profile from the 1998 exhumation and the bone and tooth samples from which it had been derived were available. The databases against which it might be matched were vastly larger than anything that had existed in 1998, built from the voluntary submissions of millions of people who had used consumer genealogy services to explore their own family histories. And the tools that had not been sufficient in 1998 had, across the intervening years, become something different. The work of applying those tools to the boy in the box case was careful and deliberate. It drew on the preserved record, the genetic profile, the forensic documentation, the decades of accumulated investigative material, and it extended that record through the methodology of genetic genealogy into a space of new possibility. That work would eventually produce the identification announced in December of 2022, but the foundation on which that identification rested was the decades of prior work. The death mask and its distribution, the poster and its thousands of responses, the logged tips and the followed leads, the exhumation and the preserved samples, the sustained institutional commitment of the Philadelphia Police Department's homicide unit, and the involvement of organizations like the Vidocq Society, which had kept the case within the professional forensic conversation across the years when the tools to resolve it did not yet exist. Each of those efforts had been, in its own time and on its own terms, a full and serious attempt to answer the question that the case had posed since February 25th, 1957. None of them had been sufficient, alone to close the case. Together, accumulated across more than 6 decades of documented investigative history, they had built a record, capacious enough and precise enough to serve as the foundation for the work that eventually did produce an answer. A record that held the boy's measurements in his features and his genetic famsicle, profile and his surgical scar and his unevenly trimmed hair and the corduroy fabric found near the box and the flannel cap lying in the cold air of the wooded lot on Susquehanna Road, all of it preserved, all of it specific, all of it waiting for the convergence of record and method that would, at last, produce a name. The America's Unknown Child poster had traveled through the postal system of the United States in the late 1950s, reproduced in its thousands, passed through post office lobbies and police department filing systems and civic organization meeting rooms, carrying the image and description of the boy across a country that did not yet know who he was. It had generated thousands of responses. It had not produced an identification. It had done what it could do in the time in which it was produced, with the tools that existed, and the record it generated had been maintained and carried forward by the people and institutions responsible for the case. That record, and the case file it belonged to, and the forensic record preserved alongside it, remained. The file was still open, as it had been from the first day. The samples were still held, as they had been since 1998. The investigation continued, as it had continued through every year since February 25th, 1957, without pause and without resolution, documented, preserved, and carried forward by the institutions that hold such things in trust for the questions they have not yet been able to answer. From the boy's remains, in the years following his burial at Ivy Hill Cemetery, forensic scientists had extracted what the techniques of their era could manage, but the material itself, the physical substance of bone and tooth, had been preserved in the forensic record against the possibility that methods would eventually exist that did not yet exist in 1957. When those methods arrived, the material was still there, waiting with the patience of inanimate things. What was drawn from those samples decades after the initial burial was a genetic profile, a precise molecular record of the boy's biological inheritance, coded in the surviving tissue of his remains, and readable at last by technology that had developed across the long years the case had stayed open. That profile was the starting point. Not a name, not a family, not a place, only the genetic record itself, a long sequence of inherited markers that told investigators something about who the boy was related to, if only the databases existed in which those relations could be found. The databases did exist. They had been built not through law enforcement collection, but through the voluntary participation of millions of living individuals who had submitted their own DNA profiles to consumer genealogy services, people tracing their ancestry, finding cousins, filling in the branches of their family trees. It was in this infrastructure, assembled from the decisions of private citizens across many years, that the first threads of the boy's identity became findable. The process of investigative genetic genealogy is methodical in the way that archival research is methodical, careful, iterative, built from the accumulation of many small confirmed steps rather than a single dramatic result. The genetic profile derived from the boy's remains was submitted to these consumer databases, where it was compared against the millions of profiles already present, and where comparisons produced not an exact match, but something more distant and more useful than an exact match might suggest, a set of partial alignments, each indicating a degree of shared ancestry, each pointing outward toward a living individual who had contributed their own profile to the same database. These individuals were not suspects. They were relatives, in some cases very distant relatives, sharing only the portion of genetic material that corresponds to a great-great-grandparent or a line of descent several generations removed. But distance in genetic genealogy is not the same as uselessness. A distant match is a confirmed connection, and confirmed connections can be traced. From each distant match, the work moved outward and backward. The genealogist maps the family tree of the matching individual, using not only their DNA profile, but the documentary record accumulated around them, the birth certificates and census records and city directories and death records that have been digitized and archived and made searchable across decades of institutional effort. The goal is to construct a full enough picture of a distant relative's family that the tree can be followed back to the point where the matches line and the unknown individual's line diverge from a common ancestor and then forward from that ancestor along every branch. identifying every descendant, eliminating those who cannot fit the profile on the basis of documented facts, age, location, sex, date of death, and narrowing through successive elimination toward the candidate or candidates whose documented existence aligns with what is known about the unidentified individual being sought. Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, a forensic genealogist whose work on unidentified persons cases had developed across years of investigative practice, was involved in this process for the boy in the box case. The family trees constructed through this work were not the simple two-generation diagrams of popular imagination. They were multi-generational documents, built branch by branch from documentary sources, cross-referenced against each other and against the genetic data to confirm that each connection was real and that no branch had been incorrectly mapped. The work was close and careful, the kind that moves slowly, because moving slowly is what accuracy requires. A confirmed document is worth more than a reasonable inference. An inference that cannot be confirmed is held as an inference, not advanced as a finding. The documentary sources consulted in this kind of work are varied and precise. A birth certificate records a child's name, their date of birth, the names of their parents, the county of their birth. A census record places a family in a specific dwelling in a specific year, lists each member's age in relation to the household head, and in doing so produces a snapshot of a family's composition at a documented moment. City directories record addresses and occupations. Death records confirm that a person who appeared in earlier documents is no longer living, and sometimes record where they were buried and who filed the report. Marriage records extend family lines. Immigration records bring in individuals whose origins lie elsewhere. Each document is a confirmed fact, and each confirmed fact is a coordinate in the map being drawn. What the convergence of genetic data and documentary research produced after this careful and extended process was a candidate, a child whose documented existence, traced through these sources, aligned with what the forensic record from February 1957 had established. The estimated age, the physical profile, the geographic connections to the Philadelphia region, these were the parameters against which the genealogical findings were measured. A candidate who did not fit the forensic age estimate, regardless of how clearly the genetic data connected them to a matching line, could not be confirmed. A candidate who fit the age and physical profile, but whose documented life could be accounted for through other records, who had grown up and appeared in later censuses, or whose death had been recorded elsewhere at a different time, was eliminated. The narrowing was methodical, and the result was the product of that method. On December 8, 2022, Philadelphia homicide detectives and Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick stood before an assembled group of journalists and made an announcement that the case had not been able to produce for 65 years. The boy found in the cardboard box on Susquehanna Road on February 25, 1957, had been identified. His name was Joseph Augustus Sorelli. He had been born on January 13, 1953. He had been 4 years old at the time of his death. His age falling within the range the forensic record had established in the days following the discovery of his body, fitting the physical profile documented by the medical examiner with the precision that the genealogical and documentary work had been designed to achieve. The press conference was a specific event in a specific room, reported by journalists and carried through news services on that December day. The name Joseph Augustus Sorelli appeared in print for the first time in connection with the case that had known him only as the boy in the box, or as America's unknown child, or as the figure in the plaster death mask whose photographs had traveled to police departments across the country in the late 1950s. The name was new to the public record of the case. Though it was not new as a name, it was a name that had existed since January 13th, 1953, recorded at the time of his birth, attached to a person who had lived and died before the cardboard box on Susquehanna Road brought him to the attention of Philadelphia investigators. The announcement was careful in its scope. Philadelphia police confirmed that Joseph had been born to parents who had been identified through the genealogical and documentary research, that he had siblings, and that his family had connections to the Philadelphia region. These details were confirmed as findings of the investigation. What the announcement did not include, and what investigators stated plainly as a deliberate decision, was the specific identity of those parents or siblings, the nature of the household Joseph had lived in, or any detail that would identify living family members or compromise the ongoing homicide investigation. The naming of the boy was one thing. The homicide investigation was another, and it remained open. The genealogy databases through which the initial matches had been found were not law enforcement databases. They were built from the voluntary contributions of private individuals who had submitted their DNA profiles to consumer genealogy services for their own purposes, to find relatives, to trace ancestry, to connect with people who shared their biological history. The fact that these databases contained profiles from enough individuals to produce a usable match to a child buried since 1957 was a function of their scale, which had grown substantially in the years before the identification was achieved. The genetic profile derived from the boy's remains was not a perfect match to any single profile in those databases. It was a partial match to several distant relatives, individuals who had no necessary knowledge of the boy's existence or of his fate, and who had simply contributed their own genetic information to a shared resource that became, in this case, the infrastructure through which a 6-decade-old anonymity was resolved. The methodology of investigative genetic genealogy had developed considerably in the years between the 1998 exhumation and the 2022 identification. The bone and tooth samples extracted during that earlier procedure had been preserved and held in the forensic record, available for analysis as the techniques for extracting DNA from aged and degraded biological material improved. The profile that was eventually submitted to the genealogy databases reflected those improvements, the capacity to work with smaller or more degraded samples, to extract a usable profile from material that might earlier have yielded nothing, to produce a result precise enough that the database comparisons could generate meaningful matches. What the 1998 exhumation had opened as a possibility, the intervening years had made achievable. The birth record for Joseph Augustus Sorelli, the document that recorded his entry into the world on January 13, 1953, was a specific piece of paper held in a specific archival location. It had existed since his birth, a routine documentary entry of the kind produced for every child born and registered in that time and place, recording his name and the names of his parents and the date and location of his birth. For 65 years, that record had sat in the archive as a document among millions of documents, unremarkable in itself, not connected in any official record to the body found on Susquehanna Road. The genealogical work had identified it. The forensic work had provided the profile against which it could be confirmed. The convergence of those two processes, one working forward from a genetic sample, the other working backward through documented family history, was what produced the official identification. The question of how the convergence was confirmed is one the investigators addressed in the precision of their methodology. A genealogical identification, however careful the research, is not itself a legal confirmation. It is a finding that requires verification, a documentary anchor that locates the genealogical candidate in the historical record in a way that either confirms or disproves the match. The birth record for Joseph Augustus Sorelli provided that anchor. It placed a child of the right name at the right date of birth in a location consistent with the geographic connections the investigation had established, and it did so through a document that predated the investigation and had not been produced for the purpose of confirming the genealogical work. It was simply the record of his birth. That it aligned with the forensic profile of the boy found in 1957 was the confirmation. The estimated age the medical examiner had recorded in February 1957, 4 to 6 years old, with subsequent forensic review, most often placing the figure at 4 to 5, aligned with the birth date of January 13, 1953. A child born on that date would have been 4 years old on February 25, 1957, the day the body was reported to Philadelphia police. The alignment was precise, and precision of that kind is not incidental in a case of this nature. It is the kind of alignment that, taken together with the genetic data and the documentary family connections, produces the level of confidence required for an official identification. Forensic genealogy, as a methodology, had been applied to unidentified persons cases with increasing frequency in the years leading up to the 2022 announcement. The approach had produced confirmed identifications in cases where remains had gone unidentified for decades, connecting genetic profiles derived from unidentified individuals to living relatives, and through those relatives to family histories that eventually yielded a name. Each case was different in its specifics, the quality of the sample, the extent of the database coverage, the complexity of the family tree, the availability of documentary records, and the work required adaptation to each set of circumstances. The boy in the box case involved remains that had been preserved and exhumed and sampled across multiple forensic reviews spanning decades, and the final identification drew on that accumulated material as well as on the methodological advances that had developed across the same period. The name Joseph Augustus Sorelli had not appeared in the publicly available record of the case before December 8, 2022. Investigators had not confirmed it to journalists, had not leaked it through unofficial channels, had not allowed it to circulate in the communities of researchers and genealogy enthusiasts who had followed the case across the years of its long public life. The announcement was the first disclosure. Before that moment, the name existed in the genealogical workup and in the official investigation file and in the birth record held in the archive and in the genetic data that had connected these things. After that moment, it existed in the public record of the case, attached to the photographs of the plaster death mask and the America's Unknown Child poster in the wooded lot on Susquehanna Road. The announcement did not resolve the homicide investigation. Philadelphia police stated this plainly and without apparent reluctance. Naming the boy was not the same as naming his killer, and the two questions, while related, remained separate in the structure of the ongoing case. The identification of Joseph Augustus Sorelli had opened new investigative avenues, investigators said, but those avenues were not specified. The ongoing nature of the homicide investigation was the stated reason for that reticence, and it was a reason consistent with standard investigative practice. A homicide case that is still active is not a case whose details are shared with the public as they develop. What the announcement had done, beyond confirming a name, was to close one of the two central unanswered questions that the case had carried since February 1957. The boy had been found without a name. He had lived in the public record of the case without a name for 65 years, identified by the packaging he had been placed in, by the neighborhood where the box had been left, by the poster that had distributed his image across the country in the late 1950s. The name Joseph Augustus Sorelli replaced that long absence with a confirmed fact, a specific name attached to a specific birth date, verified through the convergence of genetic data and documentary record, announced by investigators and entered into the official record of the case on December 8, 2022. The second question, who had killed him, and how, and in what circumstances, and where and why, remained as open after the announcement as it had been before it. The investigation carried that question forward, as it had carried every question in the case forward, with the steadiness of an institutional record that does not close until the work is done, and that recognizes, in the structure of how such investigations proceed, that identifying a victim and identifying a perpetrator are two different kinds of work, each requiring its own process, its own evidence, its own time. The genetic data that had produced the identification was not the only forensic material associated with the case. The physical samples extracted during the 1998 exhumation had been processed through successive analytical methods as those methods became available, and the profile eventually submitted to the genealogy databases represented the most refined version of what those samples had yielded. The work of extracting useful information from decades-old biological material is itself a specialized practice, requiring techniques calibrated to the degradation that occurs in organic material over time, to the conditions of burial, to the particular characteristics of the tissue involved. Bone and tooth are among the more durable biological materials available in cases involving remains of significant age, and the samples taken in 1998 had been sufficient, when eventually processed through the methods available in the years approaching the 2022 identification, to produce a profile of the quality necessary for genealogical comparison. The genealogy databases against which that profile was compared had grown substantially in the years between the early 2000s and 2022. The number of individuals who had voluntarily submitted profiles to consumer genealogy services had increased from the hundreds of thousands to the tens of millions across that period, a function of the falling cost of consumer genetic testing and the widening public interest in ancestry and family history. For investigators working on unidentified persons cases, this growth had a direct practical consequence. A database of 10 million profiles is more likely to contain a distant relative of any given unknown individual than a database of 1 million, and the closer the eventual database match, the more manageable the genealogical reconstruction required to reach a name. The identification of Joseph Augustus Sorelli was in part a function of when it became achievable, not simply a matter of will or investigative attention, but of the availability of the tools and the data infrastructure that made the work possible. The family trees constructed through this investigation were not the property of the genealogy databases. They were built by investigators and forensic genealogists using the database matches as starting points and historical documentary sources as the material from which the trees were assembled. The databases provided the initial connections. The archives, the county records offices, the census repositories, the digitized collections of historical documents that have been accumulated and made searchable by libraries and genealogical societies across the country, provided the branches, the names, the dates, the places that gave the trees their structure and their confirmable content. Both kinds of resources were necessary. Neither was sufficient alone. The work of tracing a family tree backward through multiple generations and forward along every branch is work that produces an enormous quantity of documented material, names and dates, and places accumulated across hours and days and weeks of research, each requiring verifications, each contributing to the narrowing process through which a large set of possible candidates is reduced to a small set and eventually to a single, confirmed identification. The length of the process is not a reflection of its difficulty alone. It is a reflection of the care required to ensure that the result is accurate, that the name produced at the end of the process is the correct name, supported by the full weight of the genetic and documentary evidence assembled to confirm it. Joseph Augustus Zarelli, born January 13th, 1953, a child with a birth record and a family, and a name that existed before the investigation that found him and will continue to exist in the archival record long after the case that confirmed it has run whatever course remains ahead of it. The documentation of his birth, the record created on or around that January date in 1953, recording the fact of his existence in the way that such records have always recorded such facts, is a piece of paper in an archive, specific in its details, unremarkable in its form, carrying in its ordinary documentary language the confirmation that a boy named Joseph Augustus Zarelli was born, and that the boy found on Susquehanna Road, 65 years after that announcement, is the same person. The convergence of those two records, one produced in 1953, one assembled across the long investigative effort that culminated in 2022, is what the identification consists of. Not a dramatic single moment of revelation, but the careful accumulation of confirmed correspondences, a genetic profile that matched to distant relatives in a consumer database, a family tree traced outward from those matches through documentary sources, a candidate identified through the narrowing of that tree, and a birth record that aligned with the forensic profile established in February 1957 with the precision the investigators required. Each step was documented. Each confirmation was noted in the record. The identification was announced when the record was sufficient to support it. The birth record for Joseph Augustus Zarelli, dated January 13, 1953, had waited in the archive for 65 years without being connected to the boy found in the cardboard box on Susquehanna Road. It was a document that had been filed in the ordinary course of administrative record keeping, produced without any knowledge of what would happen to the child it recorded, held in the archive as such documents are held, neither sought nor examined in connection with the investigation until the genealogical work brought the investigation to it. When the investigators arrived at that record, it was still there, as it had always been, a piece of the documentary history of a particular child's existence, waiting with the patience of records for the inquiry that would finally ask what it could confirm. The Philadelphia Police Department's homicide unit carries the case as an active investigation. That status has not changed. As of 2023, no suspect has been publicly named, no arrest has been made, and the file that was opened on February 25, 1957, remains open in the institutional record of the department that first received it, held there not as a formality, but as an ongoing matter. The case has a number, it has a folder, it has a history of assigned detectives, a chain of custody for its physical evidence, and a record of every formal review conducted across the decades since the boy was found on Susquehanna Road. What it does not have is a conclusion, and the homicide unit's continued designation of the case as active is the documentary fact that marks the distance between what the investigation has achieved and what it has not yet been able to establish. That distance, in this case, spans more than 6.5 decades. What changed on December 8, 2022, was not the status of the homicide investigation. What changed was the name attached to the case, the boy found in a J.C. Penney bassinet box in a wooded lot in northeast Philadelphia, carried in the public record for 65 years as America's unknown child. As the boy in the box was officially identified as Joseph Augustus Sorelli, born January 13, 1953. The identification was announced at a press conference by Philadelphia homicide detectives and forensic genealogist Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, and it was the result of investigative genetic genealogy work that had drawn on DNA extracted from bone and tooth samples retained from the boy's remains. The detectives who made that announcement were careful about what they said and what they did not say. They confirmed the name. They confirmed the methodology. They confirmed that the identification had opened new investigative avenues in the homicide case. They did not name parents. They did not name suspects. They did not characterize the circumstances of Joseph's death beyond what had already been established in the forensic record. The homicide investigation, they noted, remained ongoing, and the integrity of that investigation required that certain information be withheld from public disclosure. That was the position of the Philadelphia Police Department in December 2022, and it remained the position of the department as the following year unfolded. There is an organization in Philadelphia that has followed this case across a span nearly as long as the investigation itself. The Vidocq Society, founded in 1990, is a membership organization composed of forensic professionals, investigators, criminologists, former law enforcement officers, and specialists in the disciplines associated with difficult and unresolved cases. Its members meet to review cold case evidence, to apply collective expertise to cases that have resisted resolution, and to collaborate with law enforcement agencies on investigative strategies that the agencies themselves may not have the resources or the specialized knowledge to pursue independently. The Boy in the Box, the case designated by that name before Joseph Augustus Sorelli's identification, provided a different one, was among the cases that the Vidocq Society engaged with across multiple decades and in multiple investigative phases. The Society's involvement in the case had practical consequences. The 1998 exhumation at Ivy Hill Cemetery, through which bone and tissue samples were extracted from the boy's remains for DNA analysis, was facilitated in part through the Vidocq Society's engagement with the case. The forensic strategy of submitting those samples to evolving analytical platforms, including, eventually, the consumer genealogy databases that became available in the years following the exhumation, reflected a pattern of sustained institutional attention that the Vidocq Society helped to maintain across years when the case might otherwise have receded further into the archive. The Society's meeting rooms in Philadelphia have, across those years, held discussions of evidence that was first documented in 1957. Members have reviewed photographs of the boy's face and of the plaster death mask created from his features in the weeks after his body was recovered. They have examined the forensic record's documented findings, the estimated age and height and weight, the healed injuries, the surgical scar on the boy's chin or lower jaw, the uneven cut of his hair, and considered what those findings individually and together might indicate about the circumstances from which he had come. These discussions produced no confirmed identification during the Vidocq Society's early and middle periods of involvement. What they produced was the sustained presence of the case and the active attention of people with the knowledge to ask precise questions about it. That sustained attention, accumulated over years and embodied in the preserved samples and the growing investigative archive, was part of the infrastructure that made the 2022 identification possible. The exhumation conducted at Ivy Hill Cemetery in 1998 had two immediate outcomes and one long-term one. The immediate outcomes were the extraction of bone and tissue samples and the preservation of those samples in the forensic record, available for the DNA analysis that the exhumation was designed to enable. The long-term outcome was that the case's biological material was now in a form that could be resubmitted to new analytical platforms as those platforms developed, that the boy's genetic information was no longer inaccessible, locked in a burial site, but held in evidence and available to future investigators working with methods that did not yet exist when the samples were taken. The boy's remains themselves were eventually moved from Ivy Hill Cemetery to an undisclosed location. The Ivy Hill plot had been subject to vandalism, and the decision to move the remains and to withhold the new burial location from public disclosure was made to protect what was there. The gravestone that had stood at Ivy Hill Cemetery for decades, a small marker engraved with the words "Heaven's Child," funded by Philadelphia citizens and civic groups in the months after the boy was first buried in March 1957, is part of the documentary record of how the city and its residents had carried the boy's anonymity across the years before he had a name. That marker, and what it represented in the absence of any other identification, is now a historical fact about the case, rather than the only public acknowledgement of the boy's existence. Joseph Augustus Sorelli has a name. He has a birth record dated January 13, 1953. He has a genetic profile that was matched against the voluntarily submitted DNA profiles of living relatives in consumer genealogy databases, and that match extended through multi-generational family trees constructed from documentary records, produced the confirmation that Philadelphia police announced in December 2022. What he does not have, as of 2023, is an identified killer. The Philadelphia Police Department's statement following the 2022 announcement was precise on this point. Naming the boy, the department noted, was not the same as naming his killer. The homicide investigation that had been opened on February 25, 1957, was still open. The identification of Joseph Augustus Sorelli had provided investigators with new information about his family, about the documentary record of his short life, about the people and places that might be connected to him, and that information had opened investigative avenues that had not previously existed. But those avenues had not yet led to a prosecutable conclusion, and the department declined to characterize what they had found or in which direction those avenues ran. There is a structural fact about this case that Philadelphia police have acknowledged publicly, and that any review of the investigative timeline makes plain. The people who were adults in February 1957, the people who might have had direct knowledge of Joseph's life, of the circumstances of his death, of who placed his body in a cardboard box and left it in a wooded lot on the edge of northeast Philadelphia, are, in large part, no longer living. A person who was 25 years old in 1957 would be in their early 90s in 2023. A person who was 40 years old when the boy was found would have been born in 1917. The actuariality of the case is that most individuals who possess direct knowledge of what happened to Joseph Augustus Sorelli have died in the decades since his death, carrying whatever they knew with them. This is not a conclusion that removes the case from the investigative record. It is a documented structural challenge to the construction of a prosecutable case against any individual still living. Philadelphia police have named it as such. The homicide file remains open because the investigation remains possible, because documentary records still exist, because forensic evidence is still held in the archive, because the identification of Joseph Sorelli has produced information that was not previously available, and because an open case can, in principle, reach a resolution that a formally closed case cannot. What the department cannot say, because it has not yet happened, is that the case will be resolved. That is the honest state of the record. The Vidocq Society's pattern of sustained engagement with difficult and unresolved cases is not unique to the boy in the box. But the organization's relationship to this particular case has been documented across multiple decades and multiple investigative phases, and its contributions to the case's long institutional life, the exhumation, the DNA strategy, the successive reviews are part of the record that any account of the investigation needs to include. The society was founded in 1990, 33 years after the boy was found on Susquehanna Road. Its engagement with a case that was already more than 3 decades old at the time of the organization's founding, and its continued engagement across the 33 years that followed, is itself a measure of how long this case has been carried by people who found that it required attention. The case has also been carried across those same decades through forms of public documentation that exist outside the official investigative record. True crime books published across the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s included the Boy in the Box case in their surveys of unresolved American mysteries. Podcast series produced in the years when that format emerged took up the case, bringing it to audiences who had not followed it in its earlier phases. Documentary film productions included the case in their examination of cold cases on unidentified persons. Each of these forms of coverage circulated the boy's image, the death mask photographs, the artist reconstructions produced from the forensic record, and his physical description to audiences across successive decades, reaching people who had not been born in 1957 and who encountered the case for the first time through these later forms of documentation. The 2022 identification produced a new wave of coverage. The name Joseph Augustus Sorelli was carried into public awareness through news reporting, podcast episodes, online discussion, and documentary productions that took up the story of how investigative genetic genealogy had produced a confirmed identification after 65 years of anonymity. For many people who had followed the case across the years of its unresolved anonymity, the December 8, 2022 announcement was the first significant development in a case they had watched remain static for years or decades. For many others, the 2022 coverage was their first encounter with the case. What all of these audiences received was the same documented fact that the boy found on Susquehanna Road in 1957 had been named. What none of them received, because it has not yet been established, was an answer to the question that has accompanied the case since February 25th. 1957, who was responsible for Joseph Augustus Sorelli's death, and what had happened in the time before his body was placed in a cardboard box in a wooded lot on the edge of the city. The case has been covered, discussed, and reviewed. It has been the subject of institutional attention from one of the country's oldest and most established cold case organizations. It has been the subject of investigative genealogy work conducted by a forensic specialist whose methodology, applied to the DNA samples preserved from the 1998 exhumation, produced the first confirmed identification in the case's 65-year history. It remains, as of 2023, a homicide with an identified victim and no identified perpetrator. That is an accurate description of where the case stands. It is also in the context of a case that spent 65 years without even a victim's name, a measure of how much has changed. The bone and tooth samples extracted during the 1998 exhumation are held in the forensic record. Physical evidence from the original discovery, the plaster death mask, created from the boy's features in February 1957, photographs, the documented clothing items, the case file in its accumulated form is maintained in the investigative archive. The DNA profile derived from the bone and tooth samples and submitted to consumer genealogy databases for analysis is part of the documented record of how the identification was achieved. All of this material exists in the record, available for future analysis as forensic technology continues to develop, available to investigators who may find in it something that earlier reviews did not. This is the pattern of how cold cases are held, not closed, not resolved, but maintained in files, in evidence rooms, in the institutional memory of the agencies that carry them and the organizations that support those agencies. The boy in the box case has been maintained in this way for longer than most people are alive. The identification of Joseph Augustus Sorelli in 2022 did not close the case. It added a confirmed name to the file and opened investigative pathways that had not previously existed. The file remained, as it had always remained, something the investigation could return to. The Philadelphia Police Department's Homicide Unit has held this case across the tenure of many detectives, many commissioners, and many institutional changes within the department itself. The detectives who first responded to the scene on Susquehanna Road on February 25, 1957, are not the detectives who made the announcement at the December 2022 press conference. The investigation's continuity across that span is a function of the file of the documented record that was opened in 1957 and has been added to and passed forward ever since. That passing forward from one generation of investigators to the next is itself a form of institutional commitment. It says that the case has not been abandoned, that the question it presents has not been set aside, that the department considers it an open matter and intends to pursue it as new information and new methods become available. Whether that commitment produces a prosecutable conclusion is a question the record cannot yet answer. That it has produced a name after 65 years is something the record does confirm. The undisclosed burial site where Joseph Augustus Sorelli's remains now rest is a place known to investigators and to those who made the decision to move the remains from Ivy Hill Cemetery. It is a location chosen with care, its coordinates withheld to protect what is there. The boy who was buried in a donated plot under a stone that read Heaven's Child, the only acknowledgement for decades that a child had existed and was gone, now rests in a place known to the people responsible for knowing it, under a name that took 65 years to confirm. The decision to withhold the new burial location from public disclosure reflects the same careful institutional management that has characterized the Philadelphia Police Department's handling of the 2022 identification more broadly. Information that could compromise the ongoing investigation is not released. Specific family details are not disclosed. The coordinates of the burial site are not made public. These decisions are consistent with the management of an active homicide investigation, and they are documented as such in the department's public statements. What is released and what is now part of the public record is the name Joseph Augustus Sorelli, born January 13, 1953, found under circumstances that the investigation has not yet fully established on Susquehanna Road in Northeast Philadelphia on February 25, 1957, 4 years old, or close to it, 30 pounds, or close to that. The forensic record's documented description, 40 to 41 inches tall, the L-shaped surgical scar on his chin or lower jaw, the low frontal hairline, the unevenly cut hair, now belongs to a named child rather than to an unknown one. The name does not resolve the case. It does not answer the questions that the investigation has carried since 1957. It does not tell the record why Joseph Sorelli died, or who was responsible, or how he came to be in that wooded lot on a cold February morning. What it does is give the investigation a specific person to be about. The case file that has been maintained for 66 years is now formally the case file of Joseph Augustus Zarelli. There is something worth following carefully in how long this case has been held, and where the investigation that began on February 25, 1957, has now been carried across a span of time that exceeds the lifespans of many of the people who might have been involved in it. The original detectives who worked the case are gone. The civic groups who funded the Heaven's Child gravestone at Ivy Hill Cemetery may themselves have dissolved in the intervening decades. The post office workers who distributed the America's Unknown Child poster across the late 1950s and into the 1960s. The postal workers and police officers and community members who passed the boy's image from hand to hand in the hope that someone somewhere would recognize him are, in all likelihood, no longer living. What remains is the file, the documentation that was created beginning on February 25th, 1957, and has been added to across every subsequent decade. The photographs, the forensic record, the case number, the preserved physical evidence, the bone and tooth samples that yielded a genetic profile 65 years after the body they came from was found on the side of a road. These things persist in a way that the people who created them do not, and that persistence is what has made it possible for an investigation opened in 1957 to produce a confirmed identification in 2022. The case has been covered across decades in forms ranging from formally published books to true crime podcast series to online communities that gather around unresolved cases and apply collective attention to the documented record. Each of these forms of engagement has carried the case forward in some way, bringing it to new audiences, surfacing details from the investigative record that had not previously received wide attention, occasionally contributing to the broader awareness of the case that made it more likely that someone with relevant knowledge would come forward. The America's Unknown Child poster campaign of the late 1950s and 1960s was the original version of this kind of public engagement. What followed it across the subsequent decades was a long series of different forms of the same effort. The attempt to connect the case to someone who knew something. That effort has not produced an arrest. It has produced a name, and the name, now held in the official record, is the starting point for the investigative avenues that Philadelphia homicide detectives described as newly opened following the December 2022 announcement. The Viddock Society, in its more than 30 years of engagement with cold cases in the Philadelphia region and beyond, has seen many cases reach varying stages of partial resolution. Some have produced identifications without prosecutions. Some have produced prosecutions built on evidence that took decades to be properly analyzed. Some remain at the stage the Boy in the Box case occupied for 65 years, with no identification, no suspect, no confirmed account of what happened. The organization's continued involvement with cases across those varying stages reflects a working understanding that resolution in cases of this kind does not always arrive in a single moment or take a predictable form. The Boy in the Box case, Joseph Zarelli's case, has arrived at partial resolution. The name has been confirmed. The investigation continues. The two facts coexist in the same file. What the record carries in the form it holds in 2023 is the documented convergence of a genetic profile derived from remains buried in 1957 and a birth record dated January 13, 1953. That convergence was established through the methodological work of investigative genetic genealogy, through the construction of multi-generational family trees from DNA matches in consumer databases, through the cross-referencing of those trees against documentary records held in archives, through the identification of a specific individual whose documented existence aligned with the forensic profile established by the medical examiner in the weeks after the boy was found. The process was careful, precise, and long. It took decades to build the infrastructure, the preserved samples, the forensic technology, the genealogy databases, the methodology that made it possible. The result is a name in the file where there was no name before. There are investigators who have spent portions of their careers on this case. Detectives who came to the Philadelphia Homicide Unit after the case had already been open for decades, who reviewed the file and its accumulated documentation, who pursued leads that the preceding decades had not exhausted, who applied methods that were newer than the case itself. The investigation's continuity across careers and institutional generations is not incidental to the case's long history. It is the mechanism by which the case remained active, rather than lapsing into the kind of administrative closure that removes a file from the working record. Philadelphia police have said publicly that the case remains open. They have said that the 2022 identification has opened new avenues. They have said that the challenge posed by the passage of time, by the likely death of most individuals who had direct knowledge of the events of 1957, is a real structural challenge to the construction of a prosecutable case. All of these things are true simultaneously, and the investigation holds all of them simultaneously, because an active case holds what is true about it, regardless of whether those truths are comfortable together. The case file of Joseph Augustus Relly is held in the Philadelphia Police Department's Homicide Unit. It is accessible to the investigators assigned to it and to those who have institutional authority to review it. It contains the documentation created beginning on February 25, 1957, and extending through every subsequent investigative phase: the original case report, the forensic record from the medical examination, the photographs and the death mask, the poster campaign's accumulated tip correspondence, the exhumation records from 1998, the DNA analysis results, the genealogical work that produced the 2022 identification, and the subsequent investigative documentation that the identification has generated. The file is longer and more detailed, and more precisely organized than it was in 1957. It is also still incomplete in the way that matters most. The question of who was responsible for Joseph Zarelli's death is in the file as an open question. It has been there since 1957. It is there now.